Order. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. Our evidence session this morning is part of our inquiry into animal and plant health and featuring biosecurity at the border. I should say that we have one witness joining us online this morning, so Helen, very welcome. Hope that the technical issues are robust enough for you to contribute. I'm always aware that when you're the person that's online and everybody else is in the room, it can be a little bit frustrating. So if at any point you're wanting to intervene and have something to add and you're not getting in, then please don't hesitate to bring it to my attention.
Thank you,
Can
Chair.
I invite all three witnesses to introduce themselves to the committee this morning for the benefit of the official report and for those who are watching our proceedings? And Helen, I'll start with you if I can, please.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to address you today and also for accommodating me on screen as I recover from a leg injury. Thank you for that. My name is Helen Buckingham and I'm a chartered environmental health practitioner of 30 plus years. Half of that spent in local government, including as a director of multiple regulatory services. I've also spent 11 years working in central government on regulatory policy and engagement across Whitehall. For the last 7 years, I've run my own business as a regulatory consultant where I've specialised in imported food control, working closely with the Food Standards Agency and the Chartered Institutes of Environmental Health and Trading Standards, amongst others. I returned to the floor in 2021 and went to head up environmental services and port health for East Suffolk Council, which of course includes the enormous port of Felixstowe and Harwich as well. So I speak to you today in the hope that I can help answer your questions from my own personal perspective, not as a representative of any other organisation I work for. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And then to our colleagues in the room with us. Can I ask David first, then Lucy?
Yes, good morning, and again thank you for the opportunity to come along today and talk to you about the issues at hand. My name is David Smith. I'm a regional director with Border Force and I'm responsible for the South East region. The South East region includes the ports of Dover and the inland border facility at Sevington, but I'm actually representing Border Force at a national level as well as my day job. I've been in Border Force and its previous incarnations for 40 years. Started my career in Dover and I've worked through all the grades at various different locations.
Okay, thank you. You're very welcome. And Lucy, can I invite you to introduce yourself to the committee,
Good
please?
morning, and again, thank you very much for inviting me here today to give evidence. My name's Lucy Manzano. I'm head of the Port Health and Public Protection Service at Dover District Council and Port Health Authority. I've worked in government for, local government for 25 years, specialising specifically in food safety, public health and port health matters. I'm responsible for the port health function at the Port of Dover and indeed the frontier for the Channel Tunnel.
Mm-hmm. And for those of you who have submitted written evidence, we are very grateful and thank you for that. Helen, can I come to you first of all, just if you can just offer us an outline the risks associated with smuggling animal products into the UK and where the greatest risks are identified as coming from.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think in the context of imported products of animal origin, POAO, which we're talking about in this session, along with live animals, biosecurity risks really come from a range of agents which affect animal health, food safety, and public health. They're the three pillars, if you like, of what we're talking about today. Animal health examples include the viruses of foot and mouth, African swine fever, sheep and goat pox, which can, of course, be very unpleasant for the animals themselves, as well as being devastating to our farming industry. Food safety risks, the second category, mainly come from bacteria, viruses and parasites, and of course chemical and physical risks too. But zoonotic diseases, I think they're the ones that we're really concerned about today because they are the ones that spread between animals and humans at any point in the food chain. This happens via the consumption of meat, which has been contaminated by bacteria, viruses, parasites, often from the intestines during slaughter, or having been fed contaminated feed during processing or during the handling by infected food handlers. Many of these zoonotic diseases are commonly found in the intestines of healthy food-producing animals. And they include the bacteria such as Campylobacter, Salmonella, E. coli. They also include the viruses such as rotavirus, hepatitis A, hepatitis E, or the parasites such as Trichinella, Cryptosporidium, and Giardia. There are significant and widespread public health threats from particularly these zoonotic diseases, which are often underestimated globally, according to the World Health Organization. And I think for us today, it's very useful and indeed important to remember that the movement of meat carries risks to animal health and public health in equal measure. And that's a key part of your consideration, I'm sure.
Okay, just on that, on the question of movement, you have what I would call commercial scale movement, and then there is the question of a personal allowance in some of these things. Can you talk us through that distinction?
Yes, of course. So both routes are governed by legislation. And I would say in this space, it's always tempting whenever anyone hears the word legislation, we often think bad things like red tape and how terrible it is. But I think if ever there was a need for regulation, be it on the commercial import or the personal import, then I would hope that biosecurity is one of those reasons. And in fact, I know from my time spent working in regulatory policy that businesses, legitimate businesses, like having regulation when it's sensible and it does good things. And it helps create a level playing field, which of course is good for growth. So yes, there are controls over the commercial SPS checks, the official way in which goods are brought in. And there are also rules on what governs personal imports. And I can talk about each of those for about a day at a time, if you like, or I can narrow it down a bit.
Okay, I can assure you we've got enough lawyers in the committee who are not scared of legislation. But the current risk then of an outbreak of African swine fever or foot and mouth disease, which would be probably the most concerning to the committee, where would you assess that? And after that I will come to David and Lucy at the same point.
Yes, sure. I think regarding African swine fever, I think the DEFRA outbreak assessment of July 2024 is one of the most current risk predictors that we've got. It actually assesses the risk of African swine fever entering GB as medium risk via commercial channels. But when, even in that report itself, when you look at the human mediated pathway of non-commercial imports, so that's our illegal personal import route, that risk changes to high, which means occurs very often. And with African swine fever, as much as some of these others, it's highly transmissible. This stuff lives in a pate, in a sandwich, chucked out of a window. It can survive for months. And personal imports were, always intended for you and I coming back from our holidays with a bit of pate in the suitcase. They're small amounts, they're controlled. But what we're seeing here and what Lucy will talk to you about is vast quantities exploiting the personal import loopholes. But African swine fever, yes, medium for commercial channels, but currently, to the best of my research, is still high risk for this illegal personal import route. Foot and mouth disease, of course, we know, last seen in the UK in 2001, cost £8 billion. Germany has recently lost its foot and mouth free status. Outbreak was confirmed on the 10th. Import regulations were changed on the 11th. The IT system, unfortunately, took a few days to catch up. And personal imports were also introduced quite quickly. Only yesterday, we had PPR introduced as a new one from Hungary. So imports of sheep and goat commodities were suspended only yesterday. And interestingly, there's no personal import limit that's been allowed with that one. But to be honest, Chair, if you look at the .gov topical issues list for all these mainly animal health risks that we're talking about here, we've got avian influenza, we've got sheep pox and goat pox, we've got small hive beetle in Sicily threatening our bees, we've got epizootic hemorrhagic disease, chronic wasting disease, lumpy skin. I mean, there's lots of it out there. We have to protect our biosecurity from the via the official channels and via the personal ones to keep all of these things out, as well as public health diseases.
Okay. Can I ask Lucy and David if you have anything to add to what you've heard from Helen there? Lucy.
I would like to add, I think the risk is high from what we're seeing, and I think that it's really important that we recognise the intrinsic link between personal imports and that of commercial imports, and how the implementation of the BTOM is contributory from what we're seeing at the front line to these escalating numbers of illegal meat that are presenting, and that we are looking at in an environment that is entirely inappropriate in terms of containment of the risk. And that is why it's imperative that these controls take place within a BCP for containment. It is, after all, the very purpose of import controls is to keep the bad stuff out and contain it at the first point of entry, and then make sure that if it's going back out, it goes out from that point of entry. So from what we're seeing, my conclusion would be it is high, and that action is needed promptly to get on top of the illegal personal imports route, but also what we're seeing and have evidenced is coming through via the commercial routes as well, which the BTOM, of course, was designed to eliminate.
David, can you outline the role of yourself and your colleagues in this?
Yeah, of course I can. So Border Force works with DEFRA as its strategic partner to apply the controls that are currently in place on personal imports. Border Force are responsible for the frontline interdiction of personal imports. We do that as part of our wider role. We have a whole range of prohibitions and restrictions that we manage at the border, and we treat POAO in exactly the same way as we do our other responsibilities. So Border Force is responsible for the interdiction as part of our intelligence-led approach, targeted approach at the border. So we use intelligence and data from a wide range of partners, particularly from DEFRA, to apply the controls at the border. But we're also responsible for trade facilitation as well as our anti-smuggling duties. So it's a balance of checks at the border in conjunction with trade facilitation and not causing impacts to the wider UK economy as a result of that. So that's our broad responsibility. In terms of commercial imports, I have officers based in Sevington in our border facility, but our role in commercial importation is fundamentally around fiscal checks, not around any of the animal checks, animal and products of animal origin checks that take place there.
Are you content that you're properly resourced for that?
So that's a very good question. So no operational leader would sit here and tell you they couldn't use more resource, but the border is a complex beast. We have a lot of checks to do at the border, and we do them in a very confined infrastructure and with limited resources, but we do them in a way that's structured in the same way as we do our other prohibitions and restrictions. So we work across government to gather the best intelligence. DEFRA are responsible for providing that intelligence to Border Force through an agreed structure, and then that information goes to our frontline staff who then apply the controls in the most appropriate way, balancing the control regime impacts on flow with resource, with the priorities that are clearly discussed in our prioritisation process.
Okay, look, you've all outlined very well the challenge facing us here. We're going to drill down piece by piece into the various elements that you've outlined. Just before we do that, can I come back to you, Helen? What risk does the outbreak of foot and mouth disease in Germany that we saw recently pose to the UK?
I think I'm probably not the right person to answer that. I would just refer you to previously published documentation. There's plenty of it written out there. We know how much it costs. We know the devastating consequences of it. No one wants to see that happen again, and we can keep it out with the right tools in place. That's what I would say.
I mean, can you remind me, was it 4 days it took to close the borders effectively to German meat imports?
I believe colleagues in the field tell me that the announcement came on the 10th. The import restrictions were changed on the 11th. The IPAFS update, IPAFS is the system on which things are notified and paperwork is moved around. IPAFS update took another 7 days, and in that time things got through, and that was rather remarkable. And I was getting calls from inland authorities saying, hang on a minute, I've just got some German whey product turning up. What do I do with it? And I think that really opened the doors to the vulnerable state we've got, because we've not got enough clear communication coming down the pipe from central government about what to do. The guidance, my BCP colleagues will tell you that the guidance about what to do and how to deal with this stuff didn't come through quick enough. So, there is a 2011 handling plan online still from DEFRA about what to do in these situations, and yet up-to-date guidance took a while, and that was worrying for me.
Mm-hmm. Lucy, you're nodding there.
I'd like to just add one point on that. We're aware that for at least 6 days, German products were able to auto-clear the very systems designed to detect them and to remove them. So products within scope of the FMD controls were able to auto-clear the system via Toddcoff.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll come back to that, I suspect. Sarah, can you pick up?
Thank you, Chair. Just leading on from that, stats show that the DPHA only provide 20% of operational coverage at the Port of Dover, which may explain why we had recent problems, as you just described. It's been described that CESA is only making just the tip of the iceberg, and it's only 0.2% of the vehicles arriving that are being looked at. Given that the Border Force seized 70,000 kilos of meat in 2023-24, and then it's dramatically gone up in January 25, the stats are 22 tonnes. Why has that figure increased so dramatically?
So just to clarify on a couple of points, the operational coverage that we provide at the port is not connected to the auto clearance of the goods. They're completely different. So these goods are being auto cleared via Toddcoff, via the commercial routes and the systems that DEFRA have put in place to deliver the beton. The figures that you refer to, whilst provided without greater detail for all of us, that's how they came. What the figures tell us very clearly is that from the 70 tonnes that were seized here from the Border Force's records, 69 approximately tonnes were by Dover Port Health Authority. So it's when the safeguard measures came in and DEFRA started to fund Dover Port Health Authority to carry out these checks, that's where we see the increase in terms of volumes, because we are proactively in the port, and even during that 20% minimal operational coverage, we are focusing our resources on vehicles most likely to be carrying this illegal meat. So that's where we're seeing that sharp increase. And coincidentally, that sharp increase has occurred since the BTOM has been implemented.
That's really interesting. 20%, so you're being more proactive on 20% coverage, given that so we know there's another 80%, and so those figures then become quite stark, don't they? What trends are you identifying in the nature and the scale of the problem?
I think the fundamental thing is that it's going up, and that actually we've gone from, I've been involved in Port Health for over 20 years, and there has definitely been a change in the presentations we're seeing, most notably actually from goods arriving from the EU, where of course we fall under this umbrella, this assumption that if it comes from the EU it must be of the equivalent standard of what we're seeing. So we've seen a huge deterioration in just basic hygiene presentation, but then of this meat that is cheap, hugely cheap, and so there is money to be made, and so these presentations have gone up and up and up. So where they started off quite small, we're seeing vehicles that have been adapted, or coaches without passengers, as a simple example, that are full of products of animal origin. I mean, really quite startling. So I would say the trend is it continues to rise. If we are taking this out with only 20% just at Dover, it gives some indication of everything else that's coming through. And if we think that on one ferry, for example, you could have 80 vans coming through, that's a lot of work. And actually, if we're going to crack this, we have to have a strategy. We have to get this food off the lanes. We are looking at this food on those live tourist lanes that you would have all travelled through when you've done your holiday. They were not designed to be pulling out huge tons of bloody, wet, dirty meat that cannot be contained or washed down. As an example, how can it be appropriate that at a BCP, goods from Germany, as an example, may not necessarily be able to be broken down because the risk is recognised to be great, but it's absolutely okay and being accepted for Dover Port Health Authority to be rummaging through these vans. We need to do it. We need to take it out of the food chain, but not in a contained environment. The two don't match when we have a BCP at the top of the hill built for this very purpose in terms of containing the bad stuff, being run to temperature that we are not able to access. And if we could get these vans off the lanes up to the BCP, we could offload them in an appropriate area, we could carry out prosecution work, and we could start charging these people as a distraction.
How would you implement that strategy?
So we would, because of how close the BCP is, we would direct the vehicles either through escort or seal up to the facility to get them up there. And we would basically...
BCP is border control.
Yes, apologies,
yeah. So why isn't that being done now?
Because DEFRA will not give us access or allow us to operate that part of, or any part of the BCP.
You have an on-site facility in Dover that you could use to read your evidence short you would like to use, but you're not being given access to it.
Exactly, and we have relentlessly requested that. Sorry.
No, thank you, Chair, for clarifying. I think that's where we were getting to. And you talk about the, or Helen has actually talked about the exploitation of those personal limits. What percentage comes through on those kind of personal and then commercial imports? And are you checking and I suppose what estimate have you made of the volume of meat that hasn't been intercepted, going back to that kind of 80% that we think is still coming through unnoticed?
Yeah, I think that if we consider that across the short straits there's about 16,500 inbound vehicle movements each day, and any vehicle could be carrying meat that is prohibited. Those volumes are, of course, potentially huge. What we're seeing is that those that come under the guise of personal imports, it's not like an airport. This isn't a neat presentation with a restricted weight. You have a vehicle, you can load it up at your own discretion. And that's the very reason why obviously we're seeing these huge quantities, and it's certainly not what I would describe as people being confused about what they can come in, what can come in. There is vast money that could be made, and of course our farmers cannot compete with cheap meat, and of course many people will be unaware, because of the cost of living crisis and everything else, that the meat that they're eating may not have been appropriately checked because of now the ability to arrive via the short straits and not have full checks conducted.
Thank you. David, is there anything that you wanted to come on to from border control?
So just to add, in terms of Border Force's role, if we're talking specifically about Dover, but I'll cover more generally as well. So Border Force, while so I recognise everything that Lucy said, but while my colleagues from PHA aren't available all the time in Dover, Border Force still maintains its level of checks, and in that process we detect meat which we deal with. So there's two ways to deal with any illegal meat importations from a personal perspective. One is to refer to port health authorities who then process the seizure to conclusion. The other is Border Force can actually seize the goods under Section 49 of SEMA. So even where even where port health aren't available, Border Force do not and cannot ignore importations of meat that fall as illegal. We will deal with them when we find them. So it isn't just Port Health doing these checks. Border Force will do its normal checks based on intelligence, and then we will deal with whatever we find if it's a prohibition. And that goes for the range of prohibitions in place, drugs, whatever that may be.
I'll come to Helen just in 2 seconds if I can, and then Tim. But to what extent then are the seizures that you're finding down to the intelligence that your intelligence-led model is receiving and using?
So I can't answer that question.
Because it sounds to me like what Lucy's describing is good old-fashioned stop and search.
So when let me try and explain. So when we introduced the ASF checks in 2022, we found collectively and collaboratively, we worked really, really closely in Dover together. We found an increase in meat importations, fairly significant, and that gives us an indication, and it gives us data, and it gives us more intelligence that then leads to further success. So you are actually right that the more activity leads to success, but actually some of the increase we're seeing nationally is down to that process where we detect, we digest the information and the intelligence, and then we put that back out to frontline
We'll
officers.
come back to the success later. Is there a role for deterrence here?
There is a role for deterrence, yes,
I
absolutely.
think we're meeting that role.
That's a good question at the moment. So Border Force does everything it can with the current structures that we have in place and the current resources we have in place. We do have a very good working relationship with DEFRA, and I can explain the structure of our working relationship and how that information is shared if you'd like me to. But we do have
It necessarily helps us right at the moment.
No.
Right.
Sorry, can I just ask one last question? Bearing in mind that there's a facility and a strategy that could be implemented, has the Secretary of State or any of the DEFRA ministerial team undertaken or planned to undertake a visit to the Port of Dover?
No. Not to the Bastion Point facility, and DEFRA have not visited the activities, the exact activities we're talking about, which is the illegal meat activities, since they've been in place in 2022. And I would just like to add a point in terms of the volumes to help clarify that the volumes that you have referred to are the national volumes of seizures. The 70 tonnes and 24 or 71 tonnes, best part of 69 of those tonnes were removed by Dover Port Health Authority. That's from the national figure. So only 2 tonnes was removed outside of Dover, or potentially within Dover, outside of the operation that DPHA were providing. I think that's an important
Helen,
point.
you've been exceptionally patient. I'll bring you in and then I'll go to Tim for a follow-up.
Thank you, Chair. And I just wanted to come back on something Lucy said, because she's being predictably humble about this, the work that her and her fantastic team do, because I don't think she made the point loudly enough, Lucy, if I may say, that this is actually a Border Force role we're talking about here. Border Force are paid to take control over illegal personal imports. And the only reason that Lucy and her team are alongside is because DEFRA occasionally gives them some money to go and stand next to Border Force and look at this stuff. Now, it's my understanding, having spoken to several border control posts this week, just to check my facts, that even where Border Force have permanent teams in situ, they don't, of their own volition, go and look for food. If they find illegal personal food, it's a happy accident. It's not something that they go and look for. Secondly, Chair, you mentioned about a deterrent. It's also my understanding that most of this stuff is just taken away as voluntary surrender. So yes, the importer, the criminal in this case, has lost the value of their consignment, but no, there's no punishment because the legislation is a bit confusing and difficult in this space, as it is for much of port health legislation. In Harwich, on my own doorstep, DEFRA happened to give Harwich Ro-Ro Ferry, the port health team at East Suffolk Council, at Suffolk Coastal Port Health Authority, who look after Harwich for port health purposes, gave them some money to go and stand with Border Force for a part-time short project to look at this stuff, exactly on a par with what Lucy's doing at Dover. And Monday to Friday, they could fulfill it. They could stand with Border Force, they could stop vehicles, they could look what was coming in. And yes, they were finding stuff. And again, yes, tip of the iceberg. But of course, the project only ran Monday to Friday in the mornings. So what did the criminals do? They waited till the weekends and brought it through. Yeah. And we know that's the case. So, and it's only really Harwich and Felixstowe that have, Dover that have benefited from this money, but it's temporary, it's knee-jerk, it's short-term. And actually, if Border Force weren't there, if Port Health authorities weren't there, Border Force wouldn't be looking at it anyway. And of course, all this stuff gets through and it's inland local authorities, the 300, 22 in Wales, 32 in Scotland, 300 or so in England, that are then picking this stuff up. And that's a completely ignored dimension in the design of all of this so far.
I'm going to come back to David in a minute for comment, but Tim and then Jenny have been very patient.
The stats on seizures, there were 5,500 in 2015-16 and then 2,000 in the latest recorded year. Those are seizures nationally, are they? Or are those seizures at Dover?
Sorry, which figures are you?
So I've got a briefing here saying that data shows a general trend towards fewer individual seizures, with 5,500 in 2015. Yeah. And 2,000, but that'll have been at Dover, or those national figures? I don't know if you recognise those figures.
It'll be national. Are you? Sorry, I don't know. Are you which specific?
It'll be a briefing that we've had, so I suspect those are national.
Yes,
it is national figures.
Yeah.
So I mean that decline is quite substantial in and of itself. I was looking at an NAO report from 2003 where there were 15,800 seizures in that year. So the trend over the last 20 years has been significantly downwards. Can you comment on why that is?
Up until 2022, that responsibility rested solely with Border Force, so I don't know if there's anything you want to...
David?
You can't comment.
Can't comment on those previous... Sorry, no.
Or even in recent years, that there's been a sharp decline in the number of seizures.
So recently, so we don't publish port-specific data, but at national level, I can say that approximately, so over the last 3 years, so these are calendar years, so 2022, there were approximately 2,400 seizures and 128 tonnes. 2023, approximately 2,900 seizures, 164 tonnes. And 2024, approximately 2,600 seizures and 235 tonnes. But that's encompassing all elements of Border Force's work at the front line, including any that we process on behalf of other agencies, including Lucy's teams, would be in those figures. Because Border Force actually finish the process when we seize meat at the border, and it comes back into Border Force to be secured and then disposed of as part of the agreement between Border Force, Port Health and DEFRA for disposal. So those figures will be all meat seizures, POAO seizures in the UK over those 3 years, and they're approximate. But they're based on our database that collates all of those figures.
Thank you. Can I ask about prosecutions? How many people are pursued and prosecuted?
So Border Force don't have responsibility for prosecution in any of our prohibitions and restrictions. So that's a question for DEFRA. DEFRA have the policy and are responsible for the prosecution policy.
We'll let's come back to that. Tim, thank you. Jenny, then Jane.
Thank you. I just want to briefly pick up on something Helen just mentioned. A lot of the focus, perhaps understandably, is often about the Port of Dover, and you mentioned briefly about Harwich. And then slipped in Felixstowe. Felixstowe, obviously, the trade is more significant than Felixstowe, and I'm interested as to why I think you alluded that Harwich receives more funding for DEFRA to stand beside border control. Why wouldn't Felixstowe be in that focus? I say
I think
that as
Felixstowe have done some limited work, but Harwich is where the ro-ro ferries come in.
right.
So ro-ro ferries is personal individuals, personal vehicles coming back from the weekend. That's more of a magnet because Felixstowe is obviously commercial environment. So if we're looking for personal smuggled, Harwich is, as the ro-ro ferry was the better place to go, and that's where the money has been going to.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'll ask this, that's probably a question more for later really, but you talk about the BCP not being at Dover. Do you have any idea, I mean, it was a DEFRA decision on obviously what the rationale was between moving it 22 miles inland, and if at some point that could be changed or reversed, how difficult would that be?
Okay, so the decision not to open the Dover BCP at the point of entry and exit was one not based on biosecurity. It was one based on incorrect numbers, volumetrics about what was coming through the short straits, and we relentlessly challenged DEFRA on the numbers to help assist them in understanding the complex nature of what comes through the short straits. The BCP was built to be able to process the full volumes for the short straits, and it wasn't until November the 9th, 2023, just 2 months before the first part of the BTOM came online, that we received a call to be told by DEFRA that the BCP and indeed the Port Health Authority, with statutory responsibility to safeguard the nation, would not in fact be needed, because DEFRA had concluded that indeed fewer checks would be required at the border, at the exact border where approximately 40% of all POAO that is imported into this country is arriving. They provided no impact assessment or risk assessment to clarify that decision, and or indeed any confirmation of how food would be controlled at the point it arrives, or more importantly, between the point it arrives and the inspection facility that is accessed 22 miles across to other local authorities, and that the start and the facility itself would be operated without any connection at all between them. And DEFRA have continually stated that there are robust controls in place. There are not. They don't exist. They have overstated the activities of Border Force at the border to identify commercial goods and carry out or imply that there is some form of sifting taking place at the border to identify food. And they continue to refer to illegal checks taking place at the point of entry and only legal goods going forward to a BCP accessed without control 22 miles away, and most importantly not replicated at any other point of entry into the UK. And that is why we are confident and have presented evidence very clearly to DEFRA and indeed the Food Standards Agency to demonstrate that the systems brought in place to safeguard this country from a biosecurity point of view, the absolute cornerstone of import controls is to keep the bad stuff out, is not working, and we have to action change. It is not acceptable to continue along the lines of simply saying we are maintaining biosecurity, there are robust systems in place. If the Port Health Authority at the point of entry has had no contact with DEFRA, we've referenced intelligence and DEFRA feeding into Border Force, we've mentioned prosecutions, etc. We are delivering this service. We have had no direct contact with DEFRA. We are in and responding to the foot and mouth outbreak in Germany. And yet, alarmingly, we have had no direct contact with DEFRA. It's been over 3 weeks, just about to turn 4, regarding what is happening at the front line and what controls we are carrying out. And that remains the biggest obstacle to delivering biosecurity that we currently face.
Sounds to me like they're not going to talk to you because they think they might hear things they don't want to.
I think you're completely correct.
All right. Look, we're kind of morphed into the next area of questioning. So, Charlie, can you pick up on collaboration? And
yeah, I will do. I actually wanted to come to David first, just in terms of border force priorities and where animal and plant disease incursion risk sits in your priorities and day-to-day work.
Okay, so it might help if I explain the structure first, how we work with DEFRA and other agencies to apply our controls at the front line. So the model is broadly the same for whatever agency we're dealing with, whether that's to deal with illegal meat or whether it's to deal with illegal drugs. So we have a steering structure at the strategic level. So whatever agency we're dealing with, in this context, DEFRA, we have a quarterly meeting with stakeholders from across a range of stakeholders, which identifies our strategic approach in border force, and also that conversation agrees our prioritisation of how much effort we put into each of those types of work. So whether that's Class A drugs with the NCA, whether it's DEFRA and illegal meat. So that quarterly meeting takes place on a regular basis. We then have a more specific commodity-based meeting, which is called a border steering group. Equally, that's the same. That's 3 monthly, quarterly. And at that meeting, we will have attendees from DEFRA, Food Standards Agency, and the National Food Crime Unit. And that's a specifically focused meeting that looks at our priorities for illegal meat in this context to be applied at the border. That also includes any exchanges. Both of those meetings will include any discussions or exchanges around intelligence and how we apply that at the border. And then those either instructions in the form of specific instructions to Border Force staff about the controls and what we apply, go out to frontline staff, but it also feeds into our intelligence and data-driven model. Because of the way we operate at the border, we can't stop every vehicle to look for every illegal commodity. It would be absolutely impossible. So we have to be focused on that process, and that's what we do in all of our ports. So officers at the border will have that range of specific instructions, and they'll be looking for indicators, not necessarily searching for meat, as Helen put it, but they will be looking for indicators that suggest somebody is committing either a non-compliance activity or a crime. Border Force will intercept those vehicles and people, and if we detect any kind of prohibition, restriction, compliance infringement, whatever it is that's laid to us as a responsibility, we will deal with it. If it's illegal meat, we will hand it to Port Health colleagues. If they're not available, we will detain and seize it under CMA. And I think the data that I provided is Border Force's national effort. So it isn't just Port Health seizures, it is actually Border Force seizures as well.
But it's fair and reasonable to say that Border Force's priorities, guns, bombs, people, etc., and this doesn't fall at the top.
It's a priority, and we take it very seriously in the context of the conversations we have across government about our strategic responsibilities. We deal with whatever we're told is important from a DEFRA perspective. It goes into our model, and our model tells the frontline officers what to look for and what to detect.
In terms of, to Lucy, just turning to sort of operations in Dover, and obviously, quite clearly from what you've said, you're not resourced to the level you would like to be, ideally. Could you give us a flavour, perhaps, of if you could go to the Treasury tomorrow and ask for extra money and extra resources, what would that look like? What sort of scale of resources do you require?
Okay. We've presented repeatedly funding models to DEFRA, who we were advised were liaising with the Treasury. Those funding models range from 6 million to provide 50% coverage at the Port of Dover and indeed Coquelles, where there are currently no controls in place because DEFRA have not funded that to the council, although they did fund 50 posts incorrectly for the checks to be for the Coquelles checks to the...
Confirm for the committee, Cakel would be the Euro...
Yeah, is the entry point for the tunnel. So funding models have been provided. They asked us to provide a range from 50% operational coverage up to 100% operational coverage, which we have done, and we continue to have no substantive response on that to actually understand what that looks like. There are significant gaps in the controls that are taking place. DEFRA are not communicating regarding the intelligence or understanding what's actually happening on the ground, which is fairly fundamental in this. And if our funding is not secured, certainly within the next 7 weeks, obviously coming to year end, these checks will stop because the local authority are not in a position to be able to fund them. And we do work immensely closely on the ground with Border Force. Fundamentally and put simply, Border Force have the powers to stop. We are taking the action. It's immensely complex, and it has got more complex because of the presentations we're seeing. And if we are not at the port, the seizures are not taking place, and the vehicles will be put to one side until we are there to process them. That is the operational reality at the Port of Dover.
So you're saying if you don't get the funding in the next 7 weeks, you're stopping the checks?
And the, in the first 2 weeks, first 2 days of February, the Dover Port Health Authority team have already removed almost 4 tonnes in 2 days. And if we're not there, this stuff is going out on the shelves. This is not stuff where traditionally it would be hard to get hold of. This stuff is appearing in shops, on high streets, in markets. You may well be going out for dinner in normal-looking establishments and be consuming meat that has not been correctly processed.
Thank you. Helen, if I could come to you just on a wider point about the current sort of collaborative framework between agencies and authorities. How would you improve it if you had the opportunity to?
There are a lot of players in this space with a lot of distinct responsibilities in a very complicated landscape. But biosecurity threats that we've been hearing about do not respect geographical boundaries or legislative boundaries or the respective responsibilities of government departments. Therefore, in this context, like no other, interagency working needs to be incredibly united and robust. Now, I can't personally tell you whether there is joint working between in the rooms of Whitehall and beyond, because I don't get an invite to that, and probably neither does Lucy. David's given us a bit of an insight into that today. All I can tell you is how that impacts upon what's being done on the front line. And my colleagues would say there is an extreme lack of understanding about the enforcement delivery on the front line. The people that are writing the rules are not asking us to help them write it, to help them shape it, to make it workable. And that's where there's been a real breakdown in communication between national level and what's happening on the ground. They just don't understand what's happening. Now, the Food Standards Agency is far better at communicating with local authorities than DEFRA is. I think in my 30 years, don't think I've hardly ever known about DEFRA reaching out to positively communicate with local authorities inland. In fact, I don't even think they know what an inland local authority is. I asked them this at a meeting and they clearly didn't know what that is, even though the inland local authorities, who we haven't spoken about yet, of the 300 or so running around picking up all this debris up when it lands inland, either from the illegal personal route or from failed SPS checks, is the inland colleagues that are picking this up. Their work isn't being counted. They have no means of sharing intelligence with each other. And that, for me, is a real breakdown in all of this, in this network. It could be so much better.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
And David, Helen said a few minutes ago that Border Force is tasked to stand aside by Port Health authorities. They're not doing that, are they?
Sorry, could you
in
repeat?
any significant presence? you are not doing what you're charged to do and standing alongside port health authorities. Why is that?
So no, I disagree. I'm afraid I don't agree with that, and I don't think Lucy would either. We work in very close collaboration with our colleagues in Dover and around the country to do as much as we can in this space.
As much as you can.
As much as we can in this space, given the model that I've explained to the committee, with the resources that we have available to do what we can do.
So the collaboration where it happens is fine, but there's not enough of it.
So it's not I don't think the collaboration is the issue. I think we work collaboratively with port health authorities.
If you're not there, you can't be standing alongside them, is essentially my point.
So we're always there. It's port health that aren't with us as often as they would want to be. So my officers are on duty in places like Dover 24/7 and Harwich and Felixstowe. So we're always on duty. We always deal with, should we detect products of animal origin that are illegal, we will deal with those products. They're a prohibition, we must deal with them. So as Lucy pointed out, at times when they're not on duty but we know they're coming on duty, so for instance in Dover, my officers will detain the goods pending the arrival of Port Health in the morning to process that seizure. If they're not available over a day or 2 days or 3 days, we will process that detection and we will seize the goods under Section 49 of CEMA. We do not ignore detections of illegal meat. I need to be really clear about that.
Right. Jean?
Yeah, I think then what I'm not as an expert, what I'm getting is you are there all the time. You have a lot of other things to do. This is obviously not the top of your list. The Port Health Authority are the specialists, but they're not really there very much. And so all you can do when they're not there is detain. It's not your specialism. So would it be helpful to, in the current situation with the risks that we have, would you want them there more?
So resource of any kind. So this is fundamentally a very resource intensive activity. We're talking about huge quantities of meat that need to be detained, processed, bagged, tagged, and then we have to get rid of it in a safe and secure manner. So of course more resources of any kind, whether that's Border Force resource or my colleagues from Port Health, would be welcoming dealing with the volumes that we're currently seeing.
Yeah.
Helen, on to organised crime.
Thank you, Chair. And can I just start by saying a big thank you to all of your teams, you know, both at Border Force and at the port for all the work that you do. And Lucy, you've talked about how the conditions at Sevington are not designed for examining meat products. And I wondered if you could just talk a bit more about that and the risks that it entails for your staff and colleagues.
Oh, do you mean the facility within the port, not Sevington? Because
yes.
yeah. Okay, just to clarify, because obviously Sevington is the BCP in Ashford. So the conditions are that staff are working on live lanes. So that is fundamentally a really significant issue. You know, the staff also don't have any accommodation within the port, and they are actually very kindly located in Border Force's kitchen in terms of resources in between doing the examinations, because this was an interim measure designed to fill a gap during the delay process around the BTOM, and that's how we ended up actually ultimately getting the funding to do these checks, because our lobbying of being very clear with government that there was a big problem at Dover, and I think it is worth actually being clear about this, that the problem at Dover is absolutely not replicated at any other point of entry into GB. I think that's really important to remember, and that the other presentations of illegal imports will not be to this extent. So you'll be having stuff seized at airports in bags, etc. Really neat presentations in terms of being able to process them. So when we are presented with a vehicle in a live lane where Border Force colleagues are obviously having to carry out their safety and security checks, what they don't want and we don't want, because it is debilitating, is to have vehicles then blocking up and impacting on flow. And if, of course, they do find something, then it moves into a completely different environment where, you know, potentially you could have lockdowns, etc. And we've got a van with meat and all and sundry, to the point where most of which you can't recognise it, over the lanes is absolutely not appropriate. We can't wash down, we can't contain. Those goods are then bagged up and placed within a freezer for disposal when the company come in and dispose them. And what I mean by that is that the volumes are so vast that we are exceeding the freezer and storage capacity that we have each week, and that's just from this 20% operational coverage that we're able to provide. These vehicles can take, do routinely take hours to look at. They can take days. Some of the commercial presentations that we're finding that are meant to be going to Sevington to potentially have a check there are immensely complex and require a really quite technical skill to work out what is illegal and what isn't. You know, we can't just simply put everything in the bin. These things are owned by people, whether they're being introduced illegally or not. So it is not a straightforward process, not for us and certainly not for Board Force. It's not a matter of just going, right, that's all going to go in the bin.
So when you're opening a van, say, and you come across a meat product that's looking suspicious or packaged in a suspicious way, presumably there is a risk to the staff opening that vehicle. And what kind of process do you go through if you do uncover something that is found to be problematic? What kind of process is gone through to either test the item before it's destroyed or test the staff to see if they have any issues with what they've been exposed to? Is there any process around that happens?
No. And I hope I don't go back to the office and people start saying, should there be a process for what we're looking at? Obviously, we've carried out risk assessments. The situation and presentation is not appropriate because we can't contain it. These are often bloody, leaking.
They wear any PPE, your staff?
Pardon?
Your staff wear PPE?
Yes, we provide appropriate safety equipment, and the same for Border Force, but you're often caught out. You don't know what you're going to find until you open it up. And obviously the fundamental problem is that the lanes were not designed for this type of work. So, in all honesty, it's a nightmare for the staff. There isn't appropriate areas for wash downs, disinfection, etc. So we're having to work on a real case-by-case presentation basis, which just isn't really acceptable, and it's certainly not sustainable as is, and that's why appropriate funding is needed and appropriate planning. This sort of 1 year period of funding doesn't provide for any strategy to actually work out how can we really do intelligence-led work if the very people that are doing the work aren't able to provide that intelligence or feedback into these meetings with DEFRA and vice versa. The meetings that were referenced earlier, to be clear that Dover Port Health Authority are providing all the training to staff, to Border Force staff locally, but that's a really unique setup. What we're doing at Dover is not replicated at the other ports, so we do need appropriate provision for the staff.
Yeah. And you've referenced earlier in your evidence about conversations with DEFRA and engagement with DEFRA, and I just wanted to kind of get specific about that, because I understand that the MP for Dover, Mike Tapp, had convened a meeting with the DEFRA Minister last year that you were part of to discuss these issues. And so are you referring specifically to the foot and mouth issue and the engagement with DEFRA on that, or are you part of ongoing conversations with DEFRA following that meeting?
The meeting you're referring to, we were not given an opportunity to provide an appropriate assessment of what was happening. There was a meeting, the details of which did not cover the extent of or the reality of what's happening at the front line. We have consistently and repeatedly requested for full engagement where actually we outline what the risks are, that they come down and see what's happening in reality, and we get away from these high-level defensive lines and we actually roll our sleeves up and get down to the nitty-gritty and actually start talking about what's happening. And what we continue to find is that there has been an absence or an avoidance of accepting that there is a problem. The volumes speak for themselves. We have insufficient funding without a clear indication of what our funding might be next year, if at all, and what's going to happen at Cockell's, which as the local authority, we are legally responsible for the bits that lacking. The blurred bits come from the fact that we don't have the stop powers that Border Force have. Yeah. But in the actual ASF order specifically for Cockell's, it talks about, quite worryingly, that the impact on the public sector in terms of ASF controls will depend on the resources that Dover Port Health Authority invest in enforcement. Well, we are providing a national critical service. If an outbreak were to occur, the impact on economy, growth, our reputation cannot in any way be understated. And that's why we're urging DEFRA to really fully come to the table and understand the scale of the problem and put in place really effective controls, not just to deal with it, in the here and now, but actually to put a strategy in place so that we can start prosecuting, because prosecutions haven't taken place. The answer to the question earlier is there hasn't been any.
Lucy, I'm just very conscious of time, and I want to cover the organised crime element here as well. But just briefly before I do, Helen, just on that point about the conditions in which vans are being opened and the risk of, do you think there is a risk of spread from products to humans?
I think this is a wholly untapped area. Our trading standards colleagues inland are very good at animal health issues. I'm now trying to work with them so my teaching can communicate more of this animal byproduct enforcement, really yucky stuff to those that are finding it. But it's really, when you're, Lucy's described her work there. There's also these findings go on inland. And it wasn't that long ago, we had DVLA pulled over a vehicle for a licensing issue, opened the back to have a look, and there it was, chocked full, even had a till and weighing scales. So masquerading as personal, but clearly not, because that was going on to commercial. But once the meat has been dealt with, often by voluntary seizure, which is no penalty, punishment, and there's another conversation around that. We need to get better at using our legal powers, and if DEFRA would help us interpret them, that would be another step forward. I've had enormous difficulty in getting clarity on some of that stuff. But the cleanup, yes, I've said to close the loop, all it takes, these viruses are so potent, a drop of blood, a discarded sandwich on the Cotswold Hills, and ASF is here. We need to, when we've taken stuff out of the back of these vans, get better at cleaning up. But practically, it's really difficult to clean up a van when you've got wooden slatted boarding. How do you serve an enforcement notice requiring cleanup on a driver who possibly doesn't speak English, who may just grab the keys and run? I mean, that's the last thing you want if there's blood gushing around in the back of this van and it's driving off. Yeah. So we do have to think about this, and this is a vulnerability that we haven't taken sufficient account of yet. So I'm very glad you flagged it here.
There's no testing done of the products. They just get destroyed.
No, they just get destroyed, yeah.
Moving on to organised crime, and David, I'm interested in your perspective on this. What do you think the reasons behind this organised crime that we're seeing are, and where do you think the market for these meat products is? Where are they going?
So I can't comment on whether organised crime is involved in illegal meat importations. That's a question for DEFRA. They own the intelligence on illegal meat importations, so I can't comment, I'm afraid.
You, as the Border Force, the man responsible for Border Force in the South East, you couldn't tell me if there was any organised crime going on or not?
I'm afraid I can't, no. I can't
Because
comment.
You don't know, or because it's classified?
Because it's a matter for DEFRA to answer that question, I'm afraid. I don't have any information that I can share with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, just quickly, you talked earlier about DEFRA sharing intelligence with you. So if it's not that, what sort of intelligence is it that they're sharing?
Sorry, what kind of intelligence?
Yeah.
So DEFRA shares with us appropriate information through that. We have to have an intel sharing gateway, and whatever they understand about illegal meat importations is shared via that gateway. And then we have a Home Office intelligence team that takes data from a range of different organisations, and they plough that into our frontline service to officers that work in ports. That can be a variety of information. It can be specific intelligence, it can be generic profile intelligence, or just indicators. But I can't answer your question about whether organised crime is behind illegal meat seizures.
Helen, I'll bring you in shortly. But David, just to press on this point, so incidences that have been reported by Lucy and are extensively detailed in the written submissions, what do you think the motivation behind that is? Who do you think is behind these crimes?
I don't know enough about illegal meat smuggling because it's not my area of responsibility. Right. So we're responsible for detecting it and referring it to other agencies. We're not responsible for the strategy or the intelligence gathering. It's not part of Home Office's responsibility to gather intelligence on illegal meat importation.
You've got no idea where the goods were destined to go? Or?
No, I don't. We don't do any of that end-to-end assessment.
Do you notice any trend in terms of, for example, the vehicles that you're stopping? Are they all tending to come from, do they have the similar number plates destination-wise or origin-wise, or are they just a whole range of different number plates with different origins?
So all of those detections and seizures, the data from them goes onto our database, which is available for analysis. And yes, there are obvious trends that you see in Dover.
Such as?
The countries that export meat will be the countries that we see vehicles from, those that export meat that have got restrictions. So Lucy's probably better to answer that question specifically, but yes, Eastern Europe is one of the source areas for this meat.
You're seeing a high level of vehicles stopped that have illegal, I'm looking at Lucy, from Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I think you've hit upon quite a fundamental point, is that DEFRA are responsible for the intelligence, yet DEFRA are not communicating with us who are carrying out the work and have the intelligence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I ask on that because your background, David, is in customs. Originally you started as a customs officer.
Yes, that's correct.
And customs used to do investigations. Because as I say, Chair, I've been looking at this, but you did do intelligence a long time ago.
Yeah.
Do you think it's a failure that the intelligence is held at DEFRA level and it isn't shared with partners?
So that's not really a question for me. I think that's a question that would be appropriate for DEFRA. I don't know what level of intelligence they share with Port Health. I know what they share with Border Force, but I don't know what they share with Port Health. All I can say is our relationship with DEFRA is collaborative, and they share information at both strategic level and tactical level. And our policy colleagues meet with them on a monthly basis to talk about tactics in dealing with this illegal.
Intelligence isn't shared with you, Lucy?
No.
At all?
No.
Helen, you wanted to come in on these points.
Thank you. If I could just offer a helpful flag here. The FSA, if they were here, would like me to mention the National Food Crime Unit, which was established to look at exactly this sort of thing, overarching patterns, organised crime in the food space for adultery and criminal matters, and also its local authority intelligence team. So they have a lot of information. I know they're working hard, but as always with these things, can't always be shared. The forthcoming food standards delivery model is starting to get intelligence as being central to more of the conversations in inland work, though there's no focus on imports, be they the legal ones or the illegal ones. I think that's something that could be taken into account. And of course, we lost our access to Traces NT when we left the EU. We now had to build our own IT pathway, which Lucy can talk to you at length about. It's called IPAFS. It's been described to me as the Fisher-Price version version of what we used to use in the EU, which needs scrapping and starting again because it doesn't do what it should. But that's that. We used to have better access to intel before. We don't now, and what we have now isn't really good enough. We need to equip local authorities at the border and inland with access to suitable software such as IDB or other communication systems that can share intelligence and build our defence, because that is a gap in what we've got at the moment.
Thanks, Helen. I do know that we have the report from the National Food Crime Unit and they've identified some key themes, but it feels very much to me when reading through those key themes that people are talking around the issues and using a lot of jargon. And I just wonder if you could actually give us some real life examples, or perhaps Lucy can, of where are these illegal meat products destined for? What market within the UK are they destined for? Is it takeaways? Where is it
I can help a little bit with that. So white van smuggler, as we colloquially describe him or her, other colour vans are available, obviously, can mean just one van on its way to already known customers who seek a particular Romanian pork because that's what they're used to, that's what they want. So it can be one van going in one place, or it can be, as Lucy is seeing, articulated vehicles with mixtures of stuff that's been notified and stuff that hasn't, because they don't think they're going to be checked, so they might as well just drive on in anyway. So the official weaknesses at the border and the personal import weaknesses are allowing more and more of a gateway. It's been described as a super highway of illegal meat, be it commercially or personal imports. The customer base is either known, we've had it here in my own area because I helped the local authorities deal with it, where they just rock up and do door-to-door sales. And in a cost of living crisis, when people are careful with their pennies, it can be quite tempting to buy something. But of course, the person
or restaurants.
It can be either. We've known of both of those situations. Now, in a household, the householder doesn't know any better. But if the householder were to know that backyard slaughter of an unknown animal in an unknown country in a room that may not be equipped, and no temperature control, no cleanliness, I mean, the mind boggles with just how awful that could be. They are tempted because of the cost of living crisis. In a restaurant, in the commercial sense, it's completely illegal for them to buy it, because we have legislation in place that demands full traceability of food that's used in a commercial setting. So any restaurant even remotely thinking about buying backdoor kind of dodgy meat is going to be in serious trouble if they're discovered, and that's what my inland colleagues are out there looking for.
I've got one last question and then I'll hand to Henry. There's a reference in the summary of the National Food Crime Unit's report to where these products are going. It says the servicing of consumer demand for culturally preferred products through the slaughter, unlawful processing or importation of lamb and pork. I just wondered whether, Helen, you could comment on that, or Lucy.
I've probably said all I can say on that.
Yeah, if I can comment, because I'm by profession an environmental health officer, I'm also responsible for the environmental food team inland where this stuff will be landing. And actually we're in a position now where not only can you buy a lot of these prohibited products online, but you can actually buy them on most high streets. So we really have moved away from that, bringing in food that, has got cultural value and, reminds you of home and everything else, to actually a much more established route of distribution to not just restaurants but retail shops, where this stuff is sold in plain sight, displaying labelling that clearly shows that it is banned, prohibited from leaving the country of export that it has come from, because of the risk it presents, such as from Romania, where raw meat, pork, because of African swine fever, and the risk it presents if it comes in. So it's not legally allowed to even leave that country. It's left that country, it's travelled across Europe, it's come in through the border, because our systems are not sophisticated enough, as is under the new implementation of the BTOM, to detect and remove it. It then ends up on our high streets, and it becomes completely reliant on environmental health officers carrying out inspections, which are routine inspections. Unless there's a complaint, they will happen, depending on the risk of that premise, fairly infrequently to pick up these goods, and that is not a system of control. So as a consumer, you would go into a shop, it looks like any other product, and that's the problem, that we really have moved on from this being behind the counter, well, surely you must know what you're buying. Actually, the consumer doesn't know in all cases what they're buying. We have faith, don't we, that there's people like me, people like Dave, people like Helen and all the hundreds of people around the country carrying out checks at critical points to remove this type of food. And those critical points are at the point of entry, at the point where it might be processed, and then ultimately what the consumer does with it at the end. But we all have an assumption that when we go out and buy food on our shelves in this country, that it's been checked, that it's safe, and we don't have to worry about that.
Right, we are going to start running up against it for time soon. So, Tim, you were going to come in a minute on data and intelligence, but I think we kind of covered a lot of that. So
it was sort of a follow-on on the data intelligence point. It was sort of on that because at the beginning, in terms of when you were giving evidence, you talked about that 6-day gap in respect of foot and mouth, and in terms of what you've described about your data sharing and your collaboration with DEFRA in respect to Border Force, it's obviously incredibly concerning to think there's a 6-day gap. On top of all, you talked about the systems in respect of the European Union and what we've been trying to achieve since then. Is there any provision to try and work out if during that 6-day gap, in terms of what that outbreak looks like in Germany and how it's fed into or potentially fed into the UK?
That is absolutely a question for DEFRA to answer. The reality is, because of the systems in place, meat, products of animal origin, are able to now arrive and auto-clear systems. And for the first, at least 6 days, we are aware that auto-clearance process, which is referred to as TODCOF, via the commercial route. So when people actually put their paperwork in, the system overrides those checks and enables food to come in as we speak without check. But for German products, now that auto clearance function, we have been told, is no longer enabled because these systems are able to be manipulated by DEFRA to control what is and isn't looked at or directed to the BCPs.
So DEFRA would be monitoring in terms of any inland of that spread, or probably not?
No, because that's another flaw in the system, that when goods do go inland, there is no system of control. Once, and certainly now here at the short strays, the fundamental problem with the implementation of the BTOM is that goods that previously couldn't come through the short strays because there wasn't a product of animal origin border control post, so from rest of world countries as an example, would have to go through a port that was contained. So you couldn't leave it until you could prove that it was what it says it was and that it had the checks that it had had. But since the BTOM has been implemented and controls came in April, those goods, and indeed any other goods, travel straight through the Dover border without containment before those checks are completed.
Yeah, just to move on, we're getting a picture, obviously, that there's a lot of intentionally illegal meats coming in kind of what appears to be ever-increasing quantities through Dover, and that is incredibly concerning. My part of the questioning is to look at unintentional non-compliance, and it seems to me that from what you're saying, that might be a much smaller part of the problem. So I suppose my first question is, how significant a part of the problem is that compared to this obvious, really quite large and increasing issue with illegal smuggling of meat?
Yeah. So I think there are two pathways that are intrinsically linked. We've talked about the personal imports via Dover, or classified as personal imports, which quite clearly aren't. This has just created a commercial route, an unofficial commercial route. We unintentional, I would say, from the presentations we're seeing, largely not. If you're at an airport, I think you could probably say that it's much more likely in that setting that it is unintentional. You thought you could bring back some salami and then you find out that you can't. That's a far more reasonable conclusion. But certainly what we're seeing, the personal import presentations there, we're on the wrong pathway if we think it's a matter of education at that point. We're actually in an area where this is about making money. There is a clear market, a market that we can't compete with financially, and a market that many of us are completely unaware of when we're purchasing our food. But of even greater concern is this commercial import route that we are now seeing illegal meat from banned and restricted countries actually able to come in via the official route. So they're actually putting in paperwork and those goods, as an example, are able to come through without detection because the systems in place that were introduced when the BTON was implemented were not ready, were not sufficient, and were not able to identify goods, for example, that have come from a country that might just have one area that's restricted because of an outbreak. And so what we're finding, or what is clearly evident, are that despite reassurances that systems were ready, were efficient, they're not, and they are aiding meat that is illegal, that isn't suitable, to come in through the commercial route. But they're also enabling meat that is from the higher risk areas to arrive and go through the border without any checks. So even if they're presented correctly, and the purpose of the checks is just to make sure that they are what they say they are and they're not going to be harmful, those checks, those, if you like, legal presentations are also not always taking place, and that's a big problem, that's a big flaw in the system.
Okay, so in your opinion, it sounds like from either personal or commercial routes, the kind of unintentional non-compliance is very, very small, and that mainly it's intentional. Would you agree, Helen?
Yes, I would actually. And there's not a lot I can add to that other than to say, we have a new border TOM policy, which has changed the percentages of checks that are carried out on commercial goods when they're properly pre-notified. The system should look for this many % of this type and this many % of that type. Those percentages have been largely reduced for rest of world anyway. And Lucy has already mentioned the Todcoff override facility, which has largely been the default position. So even though we have carefully constructed percentages that have been risk rated and applied to certain commodities, and the FSA has been a part of this conversation, I'm glad to say, and needs to have a louder voice in this space for exactly these reasons, the percentages have been applied, but Todcoff comes along, wipes it off, so everything skates through anyway. Then your legitimate importers will think, well, I'm notifying, but heck, what's the point? I'm just getting through anyway. And then you might start to introduce temptation. Well, if I'm getting all my good stuff through without being checked, then what's to stop me putting in a bit of dodgy stuff at the back? That's even better. That's even more lucrative. Now, I'm speculating. I don't know if anyone's counting this, but it is it's an unintentional non-compliance situation that could be exacerbated into something much worse.
Thank you.
Sarah, did you want to come in?
Oh, yeah, just going back slightly on the personal imports policy, because I appreciate there's a big variety, but there's a big change. Sorry, there's a variety in the different countries, even with the EU, what they can and can't bring in. And I think the NFU are worried about this personal imports. Do you think there should actually be a total outright ban, or should we, or how would you like an import policy to sort of work in practice in a better way?
I think it would be helpful to have a personal import policy. That still hasn't been provided for the EU. That is an issue. So there's knee-jerk safeguard measures that are released. The systems are very complex. And I think that's half of the problem, that it's confusing, and then it's quite easy to get lost in the detail and lose the basic point about what this is all about, which is keeping this bad stuff out in whatever presentation there is. So I think that there is a space for a harder line on this until we get on top of it and systems are reviewed and a genuine reset is taken, because it is clear that what is happening isn't working. If it was, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't see the volumes we are seeing. They are unprecedented. And we have to do something different to get on top of this before we end up in a position of an outbreak and the devastating consequences that we have seen time and time again. And obviously the fundamental point being that learning from the past and previous reviews, let's get it right now. The same patterns occur, the same behaviours about people not communicating directly or clearly or sharing information in a transparent way, or making sure that funds are in the right locations so that we can deliver these controls. But I agree, I think more could be done, definitely, in terms of restricting the personal imports route.
And just Helen, sorry, did you want to add into that?
Yes, I mean, and I know the national pig industry have called for this. We still have these 2 kilogram allowances from EU for POAO from the EU. The one that came in yesterday doesn't have that. So maybe there is a tightening up, because frankly, a sandwich is all it takes. Why do we need to have a 2 kilogram import? So that could do with thinking about. But really, as I totally support Bev in this, the whole thing needs to be thought about all over again. We could change the rules so that port health authorities and local authorities at the BCPs, who are already doing this work for legitimate notified meat, they're already there. They know meat. Our competencies as EHOs are of the same level as the vets. We train it took me 7 years to get my full food ticket, so we can do this stuff. Let's change the responsibility, let's change the law and have it properly planned, researched. Let's share intelligence with each other from the border, the first line of defence, along with what's happening inland, the second line of defence, and really improve this whole intel capture and crack down on it. And we need the support of the central government departments to be clear and supportive of us if we try and do that, because right now it really isn't working.
Right, moving on then to the second line of defence. Josh, you have some questions on the inland local authorities.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And before I dive into the questions, I just want to say that personally I'm really shocked about some of the things you've told us today about the lack of engagement from DEFRA, particularly during a live biosecurity threat, which we know from past experience could hit our economy, particularly our farming sector, to the tune of billions, and also the conditions at the port, which obviously make it really difficult to carry out checks and seizures. So thank you for everything you're doing, even under those circumstances. So as a local councillor, this one's really close to my heart. So Helen, can I ask you, it's clear from your evidence so far that many inland local authorities are all too aware of the risk of non-compliant imports. But do you think that's the case across the country, or do you think we've got some local authorities that are very alive to the risk and others less aware?
I think there's a real mix. I think as a nation, we are understanding, we're hearing more about these stories all the time. And EHOs like myself and Lucy, we're always at work 24/7. We tune in to news headlines. We know that some inland local authorities, and I'm talking about 309 in England, 22 in Wales, 32 in Scotland. We work across boundaries to do what we can. We are alert to these things happening all the time. Some inland local authorities are very, very active and go looking for this stuff and really know how to deal with it. Others in more rural areas, quieter areas, perhaps don't feel the need to look, but they all know they have responsibilities in law. This is what I teach them and what the FSA teaches them. So the responsibilities are there. But as I said at the beginning, this is really complex stuff. It's not food safety legislation. This is imported food verification legislation. There are overlaps, but it's tricky. And they do their best. But we need We need more support from the FSA. They've got some very good people. There's just not enough of them. We need quicker responses. We need more training products. We need to be able to share intelligence better. So there's a lot more we can do. And yes, there are a shortage of EHPs, environmental health officers, or chartered ones, environmental health practitioners. There's a massive shortage out there, and that's been documented for many, many years. So we need to think about the machinery of getting more experience into this landscape and to keep them there, because this is what we will need.
Okay, in terms of the mechanisms then that inland local authorities are using to identify and remove these products, what are those, and do you think those are adequate? I mean, you've mentioned the inadequacy of the post-Brexit IT system, for example.
Yes, I mean, the Food Standards Agency puts out early warning system notifications on products and goods to look at, but obviously they're not necessarily the products of animal origin, the meat-related ones, because food risks exist in high-risk food not of animal origin as well. That's a whole other conversation that we haven't touched on today, because obviously that's nothing to do with meat. So the FSA will help and support local authorities where it can, but there could be more messaging in this space. But of course, they mustn't step on DEFRA territory. DEFRA are responsible for POAO imports, and it's DEFRA that has to be more communicative with local authorities. There has to be a way in which that can happen, because right now DEFRA is very selective with the BCPs it talks to and those it doesn't, and it doesn't acknowledge or recognise inland local authorities at all. No account were taken of inland role in border tom development. Inland local authorities don't have access to IPAFs. We don't have an intelligence system. We do our best, and there could be so much more we could do.
Okay, I mean, that's concerning in itself, isn't it, really? Did you want to add anything to that?
If I could just add in terms of the practicalities and the volumes, we are talking about huge volumes, hundreds of tonnes going inland, responsible for an inland environmental health team, and you are presented with a lorry full of illegal meat without the kit, even to get on it. This is an entirely different world to going in and inspecting a food premise. How do you control that? How do you store it? How do you move it? Do you have the delegations? They don't have portal vets. It's not an effective system of control.
Yeah, okay. And just on that, particularly in terms of resource, I suppose to both of you really, do you think that local authorities have got the appropriate resource to carry out this work? I mean, we've seen reports from the FSA and also the Local Government Association, which have identified that the vast majority of councils are struggling to recruit food safety officers, environmental protection officers, and the vast majority have got vacancies that are either remaining empty or they're having to fill with expensive agency staff. So what impact do you think that's having?
Huge. I mean, recruitment is an absolute nightmare for us as a local authority, not least as a Port Health Authority. That's why we're so dependent on the work of the vets on the ground and their technical knowledge. We will repeatedly have, if we have the resources as the starting point, we will have to repeatedly advertise posts. These are, environmental health officers are, like hen's teeth, and especially within this field. So there has to be a long-term strategy. There has to be. We are now in a position, because of years of austerity and other things, of scaling back, that we can't just scale back up. This is really technical stuff. So there needs to be a long-term plans in place. The reality is, at the moment, if you said to me, that's brilliant, you can go out and recruit 20 people, that would be really, really tough.
Yeah, Helen?
If I could just add a statistic in the pot there, the best one I could find was the FSA's Capacity and Capability Report of 2023, which refers back to the year of 2021, when 56% of local authority food teams had vacancies. That equates to some 375 FTE posts unfilled. And I suspect that picture hasn't changed all that much since then.
Yeah, okay, absolutely. And just lastly, Helen, you mentioned that inland local authorities are having to paraphrase you, clear up the goods that escape through the gaps in the system. Do you think that it's DEFRA that should be grasping the nettle when it comes to challenges like making sure data is shared and that staff are appropriately trained?
Yes, it's a conversation for both government departments to have, because they both have overlapping responsibilities in this place. Some of it's clear, some of it's very blurred. And actually, even though those of us work on the inside can't always be absolutely clear who should take over, but the FSA probably do more of the communicating, and we're more used to that, and they are better at it. But there's no real reason why DEFRA can't get better. And sometimes the FSA isn't in a position where they can answer, because if it is a clear policy of DEFRA, then the FSA aren't going to give us an answer. And if you try and find a letter from DEFRA that's ever come out with a named person or even a department on it, I saw one last week. It had no name, no date, no department. Classic DEFRA, and there's nowhere to go. There's no email address. There's no response. DEFRA are much quicker and happier to respond to trade questions than they are to BCP questions or local authority questions in a meeting. And I know my colleagues rely on snippets in chat on the Teams for their advice rather than actual advice or actual guidance. And, you know, my colleagues are not idiots. They don't need spoon feeding. We just need to know what government's expectations are of us and give us some tools, and we will get on with it. We train for a very long time to be able to do this work, and we are more than capable and happy of doing it. We're not shy of it. We do much of it in our own time. We all do, because we care so much. You don't go into this job for the money. You go in because you care. And here we are, the biggest threat to food and food safety we've had for a long time. We've got to get to grips with it.
Yeah, absolutely. We just need a bit of coordination from the centre, don't we, to enable everybody to do their job effectively. Just lastly, Helen, you predicted about 18 months ago that there could be additional burdens on local authorities as a result of BTOM being brought in, particularly where you've got, you know, biosecurity is a risk, you've got road consignments that need to be chased down, for example, a vehicle's not attended a border control post when called in for checks. Do you think that that's been borne out, that risk that you warned about?
Not at all. Border Tom, if you did a find search of the 180 odd pages in Border Tom and look for the word inland, you'll see it replicated only with regards to Sevington, the one and only inland BCP, where all the official goods coming in through Dover have to go for their checks. It does not take account of inland local authorities at all. There's been no extra burdens money going to inland local authorities, and we really are picking up the rubbish and doing our very best with it.
And do you think that in reality inland local authorities are bearing the brunt, but as you said, they're not getting the recognition or the resources?
Quite, yeah. Absolutely. There's been no additional, there's not even been any temporary additional funding to Bev and the team and Lucy at Dover, for given that we've had FMD and ASF controls switched on, and the, you know, illegal smuggled goods are coming through more and more in Dover, as we've heard today. But there's been no extra sprinkling of cash there. And they're, you know, doing all the work. My inland local authorities are running around trying to do their best, but they've had absolutely no extra money either. And no one is counting. So we are literally, that metaphor, the tip of the iceberg. Well, let's add another metaphor. Let's do a deep dive around this iceberg and just see how bad this problem is. And I think that's a big gap here. We don't actually know.
Yeah. Quickly,
and then I'll wrap up.
Yeah, there is no system in place to actually know the scale of this problem. So what Helen is referring to, what I refer to, will be that dreaded call that you might get that officers are out on the district and they found something that they think might not be legal. There is nothing in place that's telling us actually the scale of this. What Helen's referring to is when it is actually found. But there are no robust systems in place that is tracking this and making sure that it's removed from our food chain.
Okay. Look, we've already spoken quite a bit about Border Tom, but I think we just to come to the end, I'll have a few specific questions on it. Sarah, then Henry.
Oh, thank you very much, Chair. Yes, as you said, it seems that there are many problems and many communication breakdowns at this point. But I guess one question for me is sort of how successfully do you think that the border target operating model, BTOM's, balance trade facilitation and biosecurity? I could go to Helen or to...
Oh, sorry. Lucy, you go first because you're closer to this than me.
I think that the fundamental issue is actually the implementation of the BTOM. Clearly, extensive work went into it. The fundamental principle of it is that it's able to identify the bad stuff based on evidence, based on risk, and make sure that proportionate controls are in place to remove it. And like anything in life, you have to understand the problem if you're going to control it. And because the data volumes at the short straits were not accepted, because decisions were made about infrastructure that were not based on biosecurity, systems were not ready, there is no control from the point of Dover to the BCP unreplicated anywhere else. That a system was brought in place, a function referred to as Todkov, EASLIS, just refer to it as auto-clearing, whereby intentionally or unintentionally your food that you enter and say, I'm bringing this stuff in, is able to actually bypass controls completely. And not only not receive a documentary check, a person looking at it, which is the entire point, and working out, is this something we need to look at? But that documentation will be automatically processed via the system. You'll be charged for that. So the biosecurity value is of course, one of great question. We know there's huge inconsistency taking place around the country. We know the West Coast is open. You cannot have a border control post that is not part of a controlled system. The system starts at the port of entry. It cannot be disconnected from the facility where you're supposed to be controlling it. And that is fundamentally not working. The auto clearance system, we have evidenced and provided evidence indeed within the PAC, but directly to DEFRA and the Food Standards Agency, that the systems in place are resulting in tonnes of illegal meat coming through the commercial channel, the exact channel that we were reassured, all of us as consumers were reassured would not happen once the BTOM was implemented, is happening. And it is happening because the systems are enabling it to happen. It is ineffective. And for the short straits specifically, it is happening because goods drive straight through the port and there is nothing making them go to that border control post, despite statements such as there are robust controls in place. And it's not only robust controls not in place at that point, but then away from it. How many goods have been instructed to go to the BCP? How many of those goods have arrived? How many of those goods have driven straight past? Of the huge volumes coming in within scope that have been risk assessed by the BTOM, how many of those are simply being auto-cleared? It undermines the entire process that we are enforcing, or the rhetoric that we have, risk-based controls that are keeping us safe and maintaining biosecurity. That in itself is a contradiction. And that has to stop, and the only way for that to stop is that the system that has always worked very, very effectively of containment, and that's certainly not a system of checking everything as Dave has referred to, but we have to understand what's coming in. So you can't have the Port Health Authority blind to live movements of what's coming in, and then completely disconnected in terms of the facility where those goods would be looked at if they arrive and they don't simply drive past. And of course, all of this is based on the back of the fact that the BCP at Sevington was designed for the volumes coming through the short straits. not coming through the shore straits. That's where the Bastion facility was had the scope for. Sevington, that was just for the Channel Tunnel trade, which within scope equated to about 18%. There has been no upscale in that building. The car park is exceptional, but the inspections do not take place in the car park. So again, we've got some really clear issues in terms of goods being able to be, if they attend, appropriately examined in a way that wouldn't aid further cross-contamination. And we know that's been a big problem in the current position with foot and mouth and the outbreak controls. And of course, at that location, without any control with the point of entry and exit, if those goods are allowed to be re-exported, they're being re-exported back into GB. Ashford is not the border. The border is, of course, at Dover. So something has to change.
Henry, did you want to come in on this? Anything else? Okay. Look, I think this has been a quite remarkable evidence session. I thank you all for your participation and indeed, as others have said, for the work that you do. We have certainly been given, forgive the term, food for thought. And I'm pretty certain that the committee will return to this with ministers and as a matter of urgency, given what was said about the funding in relation to Dover. So thank you for everything that you have done in bringing this to our attention today. We're grateful to you for having your attendance, your time, Helen in particular. We hope you're restored to full health soon, and we're grateful to you for joining us in the way that you have done. But for the meantime, this concludes the proceedings for today. Order